Islam is a very fast-growing religion. Experts say that by 2050 it will overtake even Christianity. But there are many such things in this big religion which many non-Muslims do not like. There are very few countries in the world where Islamic practices are banned. In today's video, we will talk about some such countries. While the practice of Islam is widely accepted around the world, there are a few countries where Islamic practice is either severely restricted or outright banned. These countries may enforce laws prohibiting the public display of Islamic rituals, the construction of mosques, or the practice of the religion in general. So in today's video, we are going to show you 10 countries where Islam not allowed. But before starting the video, I want to request you, we put our best efforts to create our every single video. So please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's start. Number 10, Nigeria. Nigeria boasts of the largest economy in Africa. It is projected to rank among the world's top 10 economies by 2050. Nigeria has an abundance of resources including oil and gas. The country holds the largest natural gas reserves on the continent and is Africa's largest oil and gas producer. As of July 2024, Nigeria's population was estimated at around 229.5 million. Also, as of 2024, Nigeria has an estimated 105 million Muslims, making it the country with the largest Muslim population in Africa. This is about 52% of the country's total population. In the northeastern part of Nigeria, the Boko Haram terrorist group, which claims to represent an extreme interpretation of Islam, has been involved in violent insurgencies against the Nigerian government. This group has targeted both Muslims and Christians, committing atrocities and trying to establish its own form of governance based on a strict version of Sharia law. As a result, many Muslims in northern Nigeria have been affected by violence, displacement, and terrorism. There are occasional tensions between Muslims and Christians in Nigeria, often fueled by political, ethnic, and religious differences. These tensions can sometimes escalate into violence, particularly in the Middle Belt region and some parts of the north. While several northern states have implemented Sharia law, there have been debates and conflicts about its compatibility with the secular nature of Nigeria's national constitution. These debates are often a source of tension between the Muslim majority north and the Christian majority south. While Sharia law is implemented in several northern states, Muslims in the south often face discrimination due to their religion. For instance, in some southern states, Muslims might experience challenges in gaining political power or influence, and there is sometimes prejudice against them due to their religious identity. In some parts of Nigeria, particularly the south, Muslims are sometimes treated as outsiders or foreigners because of their religion. This can lead to social exclusion or prejudice in everyday life, particularly in areas where the Christian population is predominant. Number 9, Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has witnessed significant anti-Muslim sentiment in recent years, particularly fueled by Buddhist nationalism and the rise of extremist rhetoric from certain nationalist groups. Despite Islam being one of the country's recognized religions, Muslims have faced growing hostility, violence, and discrimination. This tension has escalated especially after terrorist attacks linked to radical Islamic groups, and there have been several incidents targeting the Muslim community. Muslims make up about 10% of the total population, with an estimated 2 million Muslims. The majority of Sri Lankan Muslims are of Tamil or Moors descent. The Muslim community has lived in Sri Lanka for over a millennium and has historically coexisted with the Sinhala Buddhist majority and Tamil Hindu populations. Groups like the Bodu Balasena or BBS, a radical Buddhist nationalist group, have been prominent in promoting anti-Muslim sentiments in Sri Lanka. They claim that Muslims pose a threat to the Sinhala Buddhist identity of Sri Lanka and have been involved in inciting violence, spreading conspiracy theories, and stoking fears about Islamic influence in the country. Buddhist nationalist groups often spread misinformation, such as claims that Muslims are attempting to take over Sri Lanka through high birth rates or converting people to Islam. These groups have used such narratives to rally support for their anti-Muslim campaigns. Over the years, there have been numerous incidents of attacks on Muslim homes, shops, and mosques, as well as attacks on Muslim women who wear the hijab or niqab. These attacks are often sparked by rumors, such as allegations that Muslims are engaging in forced conversions or halal food practices being used to influence non-Muslims. In 2020, Following the Easter Sunday bombings, the Sri Lankan government banned the wearing of the niqab in public, citing national security concerns. The government argued that it was necessary to prevent extremism, but the move was widely seen as a form of religious discrimination and targeted Muslims who wore the niqab as part of their religious practice. Muslims in Sri Lanka often face discrimination in employment and education, particularly in public institutions that are influenced by Buddhist majority views. They may be excluded from certain social circles, and there can be negative stereotypes attached to Muslims, which leads to marginalization in various areas of life. Muslims in Sri Lanka live in constant fear of violent retaliation from radical nationalist groups. The legacy of the Easter Sunday attacks and subsequent anti-Muslim violence has left many feeling vulnerable. There are also growing calls from hardline Buddhist groups to restrict the building of new mosques or the expansion of Islamic practices in public. Number 8. Russia. Russia is home to a significant Muslim population, estimated at around 10 to 15% of the total population, with Muslims being the largest religious minority in the country. Islam has deep historical roots in Russia, particularly in regions like Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, and the North Caucasus. Despite the long history of Islam in Russia, Muslims in the country face a variety of challenges related to discrimination, sectarian tensions, and state policies that at times are hostile towards Islamic practices. The Muslim population in Russia is estimated to be around 20 to 25 million people. In recent years, there has been a noticeable rise in Islamophobic sentiment in Russia, especially linked to the broader Islamic extremism discourse. While Russia's Muslim population is not monolithic, with many being ethnically Russian Muslims and ethnic minorities, Islamic radicalism and terrorist attacks carried out by groups like ISIS and Chechen separatists have exacerbated fears of Islam and Muslims in Russia. Some Russian media outlets and far-right nationalist groups have fueled negative stereotypes about Muslims, portraying them as a threat to Russian identity and values. These narratives often depict Muslims as foreign or as a source of instability, particularly in the context of terrorism, even though the majority of Russian Muslims reject radicalism. The Russian government exerts strict control over religious institutions, including Muslim groups. While the government allows Islam to be practiced, it also closely monitors and regulates religious activity. This is done through agencies like the Federal Security Service, which monitors Muslim religious leaders and institutions, particularly those that are seen as potentially radical or critical of the government. Russian laws against religious extremism have been used to suppress Islamic groups, including Salafi movements and unregistered mosques. These laws often target religious groups that do not conform to the state-sponsored version of Islam, limiting the freedom of more conservative or independent Muslim practices. Some Islamic organizations have been banned or declared extremist without clear legal reasoning. Number 7. France. France has one of the largest Muslim populations in Europe, estimated to be around 5 to 10% of the total population, or roughly 5 to 6 million people. The Muslim community in France is primarily of North African descent, with significant numbers from sub-Saharan Africa and Turkey. Islamophobia in France has become a significant social issue, with Muslims often facing stereotyping, prejudice, and hostility in daily life. Negative portrayals of Muslims are common in the media, often associating Islam with terrorism, extremism, and backwardness. This stigmatization is compounded by the growing influence of far-right and populist political movements in the country. There have been a number of hate crimes and attacks on Muslims in recent years, including vandalism of mosques, attacks on Muslim women wearing the hijab, and violence targeting Muslim communities. Increased tensions between different religious groups, particularly after high-profile terrorist attacks, have led to greater social division. France has suffered a number of terrorist attacks over the past decade, including the Charlie Hebdo attack 2015, the Bataclan bombing 2015, and the Nice truck attack 2016. These attacks, often perpetrated by individuals claiming to represent Islamic radicalism, have been used by some to fuel Islamophobic narratives. As a result, Muslims in France are frequently blamed or unfairly associated with terrorism, despite the vast majority of French Muslims rejecting violence. In conclusion, anti-Muslim sentiment in France is not just a result of isolated incidents but reflects broader social, political, and cultural dynamics that need to be addressed to ensure that Muslim communities can live with dignity, equality, and respect in French society. Number 6. Israel. Israel is home to a significant Muslim population, which constitutes about 18% of the total population, most of whom are Palestinian Arabs living within Israel's internationally recognized borders. In addition to this, Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories like West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Palestinian refugees scattered across the region are also Muslim. The relationship between Muslims and the State of Israel is deeply complex, shaped by decades of conflict, discrimination, and political tension. The Muslim population in Israel is estimated to be around 1.9 million people, primarily of Palestinian Arab descent. They are largely concentrated in towns and villages across northern Israel, with significant communities in Nazareth, Akka, and Jaffa. Palestinian citizens of Israel, most of whom are Muslim, experience significant economic disparities compared to Jewish Israelis. They tend to have higher unemployment rates, lower average incomes, and limited access to education and housing. The Israeli government has been criticized for not allocating enough resources to the Arab sector, leading to disparities in infrastructure, healthcare, and educational facilities. While Palestinians in Israel are citizens with the right to vote, their legal status is often distinct from the Jewish majority, and they are subject to different laws and practices. The law of return, which allows Jews from around the world to immigrate to Israel and receive citizenship, does not apply to Palestinians or Muslims. The Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, one of Islam's holiest sites, is at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel controls access to the mosque, and Muslims often face restrictions on praying at the mosque, particularly when political tensions rise. Israel has frequently imposed security restrictions on Muslim worshippers in Jerusalem, especially during periods of unrest. Number 5. Egypt. Egypt, with a population of over 100 million people, is predominantly Muslim, with the vast majority identifying as Sunni Muslims. However, the situation for Muslims in Egypt is complex due to the interplay of political, religious, and social dynamics, especially in relation to the government, Islamic movements, and minorities. While Muslims in Egypt are the majority and form the core of Egyptian society, there are specific challenges and tensions that arise, particularly when it comes to the government's control over religious affairs and the treatment of more conservative or Islamist groups. The Egyptian government has long exercised control over Islamic institutions, including the Al-Azhar University, one of the most prestigious centers of Islamic learning. While Al-Azhar is often seen as a center of moderate Sunni Islam, its independence has been increasingly compromised by the Egyptian state, particularly after the rise of authoritarian regimes. While Muslims in Egypt form the overwhelming majority of the population, the Egyptian government's relationship with Islam is deeply complex. The state's policies, particularly since the 2013 military coup and the rise of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi as president, have led to a repression of various Islamist groups, independent religious leaders, and political Islam. The government's focus on combating extremism and securing state control over religious practices has marginalized some conservative Muslims and those advocating for an Islam that challenges the state. Islamic groups that are seen as politically opposed to the government, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, face brutal suppression, while Shia Muslims, Sufis, and other religious minorities within the broader Muslim community face discrimination and religious intolerance. Despite these challenges, Islam remains central to the identity of the Egyptian people, and Muslim citizens continue to navigate a complex and often repressive political and social landscape. In conclusion, Egypt's anti-Islamic policies are not aimed at the general Muslim population but are targeted at specific Islamic movements, religious expressions, and groups deemed to be a political threat to the current regime. Number 4. Saudi Arabia. You might be wondering about Muslim discrimination in Saudi Arabia, but it is our job to tell you the truth that no one else will tell you. Saudi Arabia, as the birthplace of Islam and home to its two holiest cities, Mecca and Medina, is traditionally seen as a center of Islamic authority. The country is officially an Islamic monarchy with Wahhabism, a strict interpretation of Sunni Islam, as its dominant religious ideology, influencing its political, social, and legal systems. Shia Muslims in Saudi Arabia, who make up approximately 10 to 15% of the population, face significant discrimination and marginalization. The government and many religious authorities in Saudi Arabia adhere to Wahhabi Islam, a strict interpretation of Sunni Islam, which has historically viewed Shia Islam with suspicion. Shia Muslims in Saudi Arabia often face difficulties when practicing their faith. For instance, Ashura is an important religious observance for Shia Muslims, but public commemorations have been suppressed, and Shia mosques have occasionally been targeted or restricted in some regions. In recent years, there have been protests in the eastern province by Shia Muslims, demanding greater political representation and religious freedom. The Saudi government has responded with crackdowns, imprisoning Shia leaders, restricting religious gatherings, and in some cases, executing Shia activists. Sufism, which represents a more mystical, spiritual approach to Islam, is not officially banned in Saudi Arabia but is deeply marginalized. Sufi shrines and mosques have been destroyed, and Sufi practices, such as the celebration of the Mawlid, are heavily discouraged or outright forbidden. Saudi authorities view some Sufi practices as innovations that stray from the strict adherence to Wahhabi doctrines. The Ahmadiyya community, which is viewed by many Sunni Muslims as heretical, faces persecution in Saudi Arabia. Ahmadi Muslims are not recognized as Muslims by the state, and they cannot freely practice their faith. Ahmadis in Saudi Arabia are often subject to harassment, and there have been reports of imprisonment and deportation of Ahmadi individuals who try to promote their beliefs. Although there is no official ban on non-Muslim religions, Saudi Arabia officially recognizes only Islam, and there are no churches, synagogues, or temples in the country. Non-Muslim religious practices are forbidden in public. The practice of any religion other than Islam is punishable by law, and proselytizing or attempting to convert Muslims to other faiths can lead to imprisonment, deportation, or worse. Saudi Arabia has long been a battleground in the fight against extremist ideologies, particularly those associated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. While Saudi Arabia has faced significant internal terrorist threats from these groups, many Islamic extremists have criticized the government for its close ties to Western countries and its perceived watering down of Islamic principles. As Saudi Arabia modernizes under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's leadership, there has been a rise in nationalist rhetoric, positioning Saudi Arabia as a center of Islamic leadership. This push for nationalism can sometimes clash with traditional Islamic thought that is less aligned with the state's political ideology. For instance, there are tensions between the government's progressive reforms like allowing cinemas and concerts, and the conservative religious sectors that view these actions as incompatible with Islam. Muslims who are not Saudi citizens often face delays, restrictions, or financial obstacles that limit their ability to perform the Hajj or Umrah pilgrimage. Number 3. Myanmar. Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, has a small Muslim population in relation to its overall population, but Muslims have been a target of systematic discrimination and violence, particularly in recent decades. The Muslim community in Myanmar, especially the Rohingya Muslims, has faced severe persecution, both from the government and extremist Buddhist nationalist groups. The situation is rooted in a complex combination of ethnic, religious, and political factors that have created a volatile and hostile environment for Muslims, resulting in mass displacement, human rights violations, and ongoing conflicts. The Rohingya Muslims are an ethnic minority group in Myanmar, predominantly residing in the Rakhine state. They are culturally and linguistically distinct from the majority Buddhist population, and their status in the country has long been contentious. Despite the Rohingya having lived in Myanmar for generations, they have been denied citizenship under the 1982 citizenship law, which effectively makes them stateless. The Rohingya have been subjected to widespread ethnic cleansing by the Myanmar military and Buddhist nationalist groups. Since 2012, the Rohingya have been subjected to violent attacks, forced displacement, and mass killings. The military's actions in 2017 in particular were widely condemned as genocide, with reports of widespread rapes, killings, and destruction of entire villages. The United Nations has described these acts as textbook ethnic cleansing and genocide. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslims have fled to neighboring Bangladesh and India as refugees, escaping persecution. The 2017 crisis saw more than 700,000 Rohingya forced into refugee camps in Bangladesh, where they continue to face difficult conditions. The Burmese government has denied the right of return for Rohingya refugees and has not provided a framework for reintegrating them back into Myanmar. For instance, there are laws that restrict interfaith marriages, particularly between Buddhist women and Muslim men. Muslim men must seek permission from the government to marry Buddhist women, which restricts their religious and personal freedoms. In some regions, Muslim families face restrictions on family size. For example, in the Rakhine state, a two-child policy has been imposed specifically on Muslims, further fueling the resentment towards Muslims by framing them as a demographic threat. Muslims in Myanmar face restrictions on religious gatherings. The government has at times cracked down on Islamic preaching and proselytization, especially in areas where Muslim populations are growing, out of concern for increasing religious influence. Mosques have been raided, and Islamic schools have faced restrictions. In some areas, Muslims have faced pressure to give up the halal meat trade, which is a significant part of their religious and economic life. Buddhist extremists have targeted halal butchers and Muslim-owned businesses, labeling them as threats to Buddhist culture. Number 2. India. India is home to one of the world's largest Muslim populations, estimated at around 200 million people, making up about 14% of the total population. Despite India's historical tradition of religious pluralism, the country has witnessed increasing anti-Muslim sentiment in recent years. This sentiment is often fueled by a combination of political, religious, and social factors, including the rise of Hindu nationalism and communal politics. Several anti-Muslim policies, incidents, and attitudes have emerged, exacerbating tensions and sometimes leading to violence and discrimination against Muslims. The rise of Hindu nationalist ideology in India, particularly represented by the Bharatiya Janata Party or BJP, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has contributed to a climate of religious intolerance. The BJP and its ideological parent, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh or RSS, promote a vision of India as a Hindu nation, which has alienated Muslims and other religious minorities. While the Indian constitution guarantees secularism and equal treatment for all religions, the rise of the Hindutva movement has challenged these principles. The BJP has been accused of fostering communal polarization, using anti-Muslim rhetoric and policies to consolidate Hindu votes. The rhetoric often frames Muslims as foreigners or invaders, sometimes linking them to issues like terrorism, illegal immigration, or even the partition of India in 1947, when millions of Muslims moved to Pakistan. However, according to me, BJP is a nationalist party and the core religion of India is Hinduism, and it is also true that Islam came to India much later and Muslim invaders also did many forced conversions. In states like Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and Madhya Pradesh, there have been instances of Hindu-Muslim violence where BJP-led or BJP-aligned groups have been accused of instigating or failing to prevent violence against Muslims. The Gujarat riots of 2002, when Modi was the chief minister of Gujarat, remain one of the most contentious and widely discussed instances of communal violence, with significant anti-Muslim violence during that time. The Citizenship Amendment Act is one of the most controversial laws passed by the Indian government. The law offers fast-track citizenship to non-Muslim religious minorities like Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, and Christians from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan who entered India before 2014. Critics argue that the CAA discriminates against Muslims because it explicitly excludes them, violating the principle of equal treatment under the Constitution. The law sparked widespread protests in 2020, especially among Muslim communities, who viewed it as part of a broader effort to marginalize them and make them second-class citizens. Muslims in India face a variety of challenges, ranging from discriminatory laws and violence to social marginalization and religious intolerance. Number 1. China. China's treatment of its Muslim population, particularly the Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang region, has drawn widespread international condemnation for what many human rights organizations, governments, and scholars have labeled as cultural, religious, and ethnic repression, and in some cases, genocide. The Chinese government's policies towards Muslims, particularly the Uyghur and Kazakh Muslims, have been characterized by extreme surveillance, forced assimilation, religious restrictions, and mass detention. While China's treatment of its Muslim population is complex and varies by region, the Uyghurs have been the most severely affected group. Since 2017, reports from human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have confirmed the existence of large-scale internment camps in Xinjiang, where hundreds of thousands, potentially over 1 million, Uyghur Muslims and other Muslim minorities like Kazakh Muslims are believed to have been detained without trial. The Chinese government has referred to these camps as re-education or vocational training centers, claiming they are aimed at combating extremism and terrorism. However, reports from former detainees and human rights organizations paint a different picture, describing conditions of forced labor, indoctrination, torture, and cultural suppression. Detainees are subjected to intense indoctrination to erase their religious and cultural identities. This includes compulsory Mandarin Chinese language courses, political education, and atheism indoctrination. Religious practices such as praying, fasting during Ramadan, and wearing traditional Islamic attire such as the hijab or beard are banned or restricted in these camps. Uyghur culture, including their distinct language and customs, is under threat, with Chinese authorities encouraging assimilation into the dominant Han Chinese culture. Xinjiang has become one of the most heavily surveilled regions in the world. The Chinese government has implemented an advanced surveillance system that uses facial recognition technology, mobile phone tracking, and social media monitoring to track and control Uyghurs and other Muslim populations. Checkpoint systems and police patrols are also common in urban areas, and Xinjiang residents are frequently required to show identification and submit biometric data, such as fingerprints and iris scans. One of the most alarming aspects of China's policies in Xinjiang is the forced sterilization and birth control measures imposed on Uyghur women. Reports from the United Nations and human rights organizations have indicated that Chinese authorities have been engaged in a campaign of forced sterilization, abortions, and other measures to limit the birth rate among Uyghur Muslims. This has been characterized as part of an effort to suppress the Uyghur population through genocide. Reports indicate that China has systematically destroyed mosques, madrasas, and other religious sites across Xinjiang. Many mosques have been either demolished or repurposed for state use, and traditional Islamic architectural elements have been removed. The Xinjiang region is home to some of the oldest and most important Uyghur cultural and religious sites, but many of these are being erased in the name of modernization or counter-extremism. For example, Idka Mosque, the largest mosque in Xinjiang, has been subjected to heavy government scrutiny and control. Since the 2010s, a series of restrictions have been placed on Muslim religious practices in Xinjiang. The government has implemented a ban on religious education, and young people are forbidden from participating in religious practices like fasting during Ramadan or even attending mosques. The hijab is often prohibited for women, and beards are discouraged for men. Religious groups are also required to register with the government, and unregistered religious activities are often banned. Chinese authorities have imposed strict control over religious media, and Islamic books and literature have been censored or removed. The internet is heavily controlled, and the government actively monitors online activity related to Islam. Many religious websites, including those offering Quranic teachings, have been taken down or blocked. Many detainees in the re-education camps are reportedly subjected to forced labor, where they are coerced into working in factories or on agricultural projects under harsh conditions. Products made from forced labor are believed to end up in international markets, including garments, solar panels, and electronics. There have been reports that the Chinese government has used Uyghur Muslims for slave labor in cotton production, a significant industry in Xinjiang, which has been subject to international scrutiny. China has also established a network of surveillance and intelligence gathering operations across the globe to track and monitor Uyghurs, particularly those who have fled to countries like Turkey, the United States, Germany, and Kazakhstan. Many Uyghur exiles report feeling threatened or harassed by Chinese officials, who demand their loyalty and discourage them from speaking out about the situation in Xinjiang. However, it is a different matter that despite so much atrocities against Muslims in China, countries like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, which call themselves a staunch Islamic country, do not even say a single word for China. If something happens against Muslims in any other country except any Muslim country, then all the 57 world countries come together and start protesting against that country. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.